You've probably seen them sitting there in the back half of your Bible. 13 books. 13 names that sound like ancient cities or people you've never met. Romans, Ephesians, Thessalonians. Maybe you've tried to read them. Maybe you opened to a random page, hit a wall of massive theological words and quietly closed the book. It feels like reading a textbook written for someone much smarter or much holier than you. But here is the truth about those 13 books. They were never meant to be textbooks. They were letters. Some of them were written in dark, freezing prison cells. Some were written in a rush. They were sent to real people who were dealing with messy, chaotic, entirely overwhelming lives. They were written to people who were worried about money, fighting with their neighbors, terrified of the future, and wondering if God had forgotten them. They were written to people exactly like you. Here's where we're headed today. We are going to open all 13 of the Apostle Paul's letters, not to study ancient Greek, not to debate theology. We are going to look at the exact human problem each letter was trying to solve. Because the moment you stop reading them as chapters in a book and start reading them as mail, everything changes. You know the feeling of trying to keep all the plates spinning. You're doing the right things. You're saying the right prayers. You're trying to be a good parent, a good worker, a good person. But underneath it all, there is a quiet, heavy exhaustion. You feel like you are always one mistake away from failing the test, one bad day away from God crossing your name off the list. That is exactly who Paul was writing to in the book of Romans. Romans is the longest letter. It's the one with the heaviest words. But here's the part most people skip. When Paul uses a massive, intimidating word like justification, he is actually offering you a deep breath. In the ancient Roman world, justification was a courtroom word. It meant the judge banged the gavel and said, "You are cleared. The debt is gone." Paul isn't writing Romans to make you work harder. He's writing to tell you the work is already done. He is telling an exhausted group of people to put down their clipboards, to stop keeping score. If you've ever felt like your faith is a performance you have to maintain, Romans is the letter that tells you the curtain has closed, the show is over, and you are loved anyway. Imagine the most chaotic group chat on your phone, the one where people are arguing, taking sides, and misunderstanding each other on purpose. That was the church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians isn't a polite letter to a quiet church. It is an urgent response to a community that was completely falling apart. They were suing each other. They were fighting over who was the most spiritual. They were treating a worship service like a competition. When you read 1 Corinthians, you realize that the early Christians were just as flawed, just as petty, and just as difficult as people are today. But Paul doesn't tell them to just try harder to be nice. He points them back to the cross. He reminds them that true love isn't a feeling, it's an action. When you hear the famous "love is patient, love is kind" chapter at a wedding, remember the context. It wasn't written for two people in love. It was written for a room full of people who couldn't stand each other. 1 Corinthians is the letter for when your community is broken, reminding you that grace is the only glue that holds messy people together. You've looked in the mirror and thought, "I am not enough for this." Maybe it's a new job. Maybe it's raising a child. You feel completely unqualified, and you are terrified that everyone is about to find out. 2 Corinthians is Paul's most vulnerable letter. The people in Corinth were actually questioning his authority. They said he wasn't a good enough speaker. They said he didn't look impressive enough. And Paul's response is entirely unexpected. He agrees with them. He doesn't list his accomplishments. He talks about his suffering. He talks about a thorn in his flesh, a pain or a struggle that God refused to take away, no matter how hard he prayed. He writes 2 Corinthians to tell you that God doesn't need your perfection. God uses your weakness. Your cracks are exactly where the light gets in. If you are feeling fragile today, this letter is your reminder that you do not have to be strong to be used by God. You just have to be willing. You've met people who make faith feel like a prison. They hand you a list of rules, how to dress, what to eat, who to vote for. They tell you that Jesus is good, but you need Jesus, plus all these other things if you really want to be accepted. Paul wrote Galatians because he was absolutely furious about this. Galatians is an angry, passionate letter. False teachers had moved into the region of Galatia and started handing out clipboards. They were telling new believers that they had to follow ancient religious laws to be truly loved by God. Paul writes to tell them to tear up the checklist. He reminds them that freedom is the entire point of the gospel. You cannot add to what Jesus did. If you grew up in a strict, punishing religious environment, Galatians is the letter that unlocks the cage and tells you to walk out. You wake up, look at your phone, and immediately let the world tell you who you are. Your bank account tells you your worth. Your boss tells you your value. The mirror tells you your flaws. Ephesians is the letter you read when you have forgotten who you actually are. The first half of Ephesians doesn't ask you to do a single thing, not one. It just spends 3 chapters pouring out blessings, reminding you of your true identity. You are chosen. You are adopted. You are forgiven. You are a masterpiece. Paul knows that you cannot live a good life until you know you are deeply loved. Only in the second half of the letter does he tell you how to live, how to treat your family, how to fight spiritual battles, because action always has to flow from identity. If you feel lost today, Ephesians is the mirror that shows you what God sees when he looks at you. Imagine sitting on a cold stone floor, chained to a guard, not knowing if you will survive the month. Now imagine writing a letter about joy. That is the book of Philippians. Paul wrote it from a Roman prison, but it is the happiest letter in the New Testament. The word joy or rejoice is used over and over again. How do you find peace when your life is falling apart? Paul says it's because joy is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness is tied to what happens to you. Joy is tied to who is with you. Paul had lost his freedom, his comfort, and his safety, but he hadn't lost Jesus. If you are in a season where nothing is going right, a bad medical report, a broken relationship, a financial crisis, Philippians is the letter that teaches you how to anchor your heart to something deeper than your circumstances. You've scrolled through social media and seen the influencers selling the next big spiritual secret. A new meditation, a new diet, a new mindset that promises to finally bring you enlightenment. The church in Colossae was dealing with the exact same thing. They were being distracted by philosophies, mysticism, and spiritual fads. They were worried they were missing out on some higher level of spirituality. Paul writes Colossians to tell them one simple truth: Jesus is enough. You don't need a secret code. You don't need a special diet. You don't need to worship angels or follow strict moon calendars. Everything you are searching for is already found in Christ. When the world tries to sell you an upgrade, Colossians reminds you that you already have the premium version. We still have 6 letters left, some of the most personal ones Paul ever wrote. But before we open them, let me ask you a question. Which of these first 7 letters hits closest to home for you today? Are you exhausted like the Romans? Are you needing peace like the Philippians? Leave a comment below and tell me which one you need right now. And if this journey is bringing you some clarity, hit subscribe. We have a lot more pages to open together. Now let's look at what happens when the future feels terrifying. You've stood at a graveside. You've felt that heavy, crushing finality. The believers in Thessalonica were terrified. They believed Jesus was returning soon, but their friends and family members were starting to die. They panicked. Did their loved ones miss out? Was it all for nothing? 1 Thessalonians is a letter of deep comfort. Paul writes to tell them that death is not a period, it's a comma. He doesn't tell them not to cry. Christianity never asks you to pretend you aren't sad. But he tells them they don't have to grieve like people who have no hope. If you have lost someone you love, this letter is a quiet whisper that the goodbye is only temporary. Morning is coming. You've seen the news. You've watched the headlines get darker. wars, rumors, economic collapse. It's easy to look around and think, the world is ending tomorrow. The Thessalonian church actually believed that. Someone had sent them a fake letter claiming the day of the Lord had already happened and they had been left behind. They were terrified. Some of them even quit their jobs and just sat around waiting for the end. Paul writes 2 Thessalonians to calm them down. He tells them to stop panicking. He tells them to go back to work, to live quiet, responsible lives, to keep doing the next right thing. When the world feels like it's spinning out of control, 2 Thessalonians is the hand on your shoulder telling you to breathe. God is not panicked. You shouldn't be either. You've been asked to step up. A promotion, leading a family, guiding a project. And your first thought is, I am way too young for this. I am way too inexperienced for this. Timothy felt the same way. He was a young man tasked with leading a massive, complicated church in the city of Ephesus. He was dealing with false teachers, wealthy donors who wanted their way, and older people who didn't respect him. He was stressed, and his stomach hurt all the time. 1 Timothy is a mentor, writing to his stressed-out student. Paul gives him practical advice on how to organize a community. But more importantly, he tells Timothy, do not let anyone look down on you because you are young. He tells him to lead by example. If you feel overwhelmed by the responsibilities sitting on your shoulders, 1 Timothy is the playbook for leading with quiet integrity. You know what it's like to have a final conversation with someone you love. You know how carefully you choose your words. 2 Timothy is the last thing Paul ever wrote. He is back in a Roman dungeon, but this time he knows he isn't getting out. He is facing execution. He is cold. He is lonely. Most of his friends have abandoned him. He writes this letter to Timothy, asking him to come quickly and to bring his heavy coat before winter sets in. It is incredibly human. But it is not a letter of defeat. Paul writes, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He is passing the baton. If you are facing the end of a season or even the end of a life, 2 Timothy shows you how to cross the finish line with your head held high, knowing the crown is waiting. You work in an office or live in a neighborhood where the culture is just toxic. People lie. People take advantage of each other. Doing the right thing feels like a disadvantage. Titus was stationed on the island of Crete, and in the ancient world, Crete was famous for being a terrible place. They were known as liars, gluttons, and cheats. It was a brutal culture. How do you live a good life in a bad place? Paul tells Titus not to run away. He tells him to plant churches that look like oases in a desert. He tells him to teach people to be self-controlled, honest, and kind. Titus is the letter that reminds you that you do not have to conform to the room you are standing in. You can change the temperature of the room just by being faithful. We end with the shortest letter, just 1 page. But it contains the hardest assignment in the entire Bible. You've been hurt. Someone wronged you deeply, and the last thing you want to do is forgive them. Philemon was a wealthy Christian who owned a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus ran away, probably stealing from Philemon in the process. Through a crazy series of events, Onesimus meets Paul in prison, becomes a Christian, and becomes Paul's dear friend. Paul writes this tiny letter to Philemon, and he sends it back in the hands of the runaway. Paul asks Philemon to do the unthinkable. He asks him to take Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a brother. He asks him to forgive the debt. Philemon is the letter for when forgiveness feels impossible. It reminds us that because God cancelled our massive debt, we are called to cancel the debts of others, even when it hurts. Let's put it all on the table. 13 letters. From a man in chains to people trying to figure out how to live. Romans gives you grace when you're exhausted. The Corinthians letters give you glue for your broken relationships and strength for your weakness. Galatians gives you freedom from toxic rules. Ephesians gives you your true identity. Philippians gives you joy in the dark. Colossians gives you focus. The Thessalonian letters give you hope in grief and calm in the panic. The Timothy letters give you courage to lead and grace to finish well. Titus shows you how to live in a dark world, and Philemon shows you how to forgive. So here is what this means for your Monday morning. The Bible is not a museum of flawless saints. It is a messy, beautiful record of God working with real people. People who argued, people who cried, people who panicked. The next time you open the back half of your New Testament, don't read it like a theological exam you have to pass. Read it like a letter from a friend. Read it knowing that the same grace that reached a chaotic church in Corinth and a terrified young man in Ephesus is the exact same grace reaching for you right now. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to open the envelope. If this found you today, it found you for a reason. Come back next week. We'll open the next page together.